My grandfather was the kind of man who had an impact on others. Whether he be dressing up as Santa Claus for me, my siblings, and our 16 cousins, imparting his wisdom through stories, or making us laugh with an inappropriate joke, he lit up whatever room he was in. If you look at the second slide on the PowerPoint presentation I uploaded along with my speech, you can see some pictures of my grandfather in his prime. He was always smiling, cheerful, and laughing. My grandfather, dubbed the leader of the band by my aunt for his ability to solve problems and provide meaningful advice, was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia at the age of 67. Sufferers of this disease experience confusion, visual hallucinations, memory loss, nervous system malfunctions, balance problems, and rigid muscles. We watched our strong and capable workaholic grandfather devolve into a shell of the man he once was. As well as the mental aspects of this disease, my grandfather experienced physical symptoms. He lost weight, he was unable to stand without assistance, and most notably, his face was frozen in what is called the Parkinson's mask. Sufferers of Parkinson's and other degenerative diseases exhibit this facial expression as an open, drooping mouth. If you look at the third slide of the PowerPoint presentation, you can see how much he devolved in the 5 years of battling the disease that would eventually take his life. For my persuasive speech, I have decided to examine the topic of euthanasia. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, euthanasia is defined as the painless killing of a patient suffering from an incurable and painful disease. This is a topic that I have had some interest in for a long while. It began after I viewed a PBS documentary called The Suicide Tourist that follows a man named Craig Ewert as he grapples with the idea of ending his own life. He was diagnosed with ALS and was destined to suffer death due to either respiratory failure, malnutrition as a result of swallowing problems, pulmonary embolism, cardiac arrhythmias, or pneumonia caused by aspiration. These are the most common cases of death in ALS patients as listed on the Muscular Dystrophy Association website. Ewert decided to take matters into his own hands. He traveled to Switzerland, where physician-assisted suicide is legal, and died peacefully, next to his wife, surrounded by his favorite music, and most importantly, on his own terms. By the end of this speech, I hope you will understand why I believe euthanasia should be legal across the nation. When my grandfather was diagnosed, it wasn't much of a shock. Both of his parents had died of some form of dementia. However, it saddened me to think of what my grandfather went through, especially when I think that this was the one way he did not want to go out. I was too young to remember when Pop, my great-grandfather, died, but I do remember when Nana downstairs, named because she lived in the finished basement of my grandparents' house, passed away. I was 10 years old when she passed, but I did not find out how terrible her death was until years later. She suffered until the end, so much so that it was a blessing when she finally passed. I remember my grandfather saying to my dad, if I ever end up like that, put a bullet in my head. Not the most eloquent of requests, but his point still rang clear. Years later, when my grandfather received his diagnosis, my dad had to remove the guns from my grandparents' house in fear that my grandfather would make good on his word. Historically, there are three main types of euthanasia. These are voluntary, involuntary, and non-voluntary. An ethics page run by the BBC explains most simply how these categories differ. Voluntary euthanasia occurs at the request of the person who dies. So this would be someone like Craig Ewert, as I discussed earlier. He went to Switzerland, expressed his decision to want to die, and ended his life with the assistance of a doctor. Non-voluntary euthanasia occurs when the decision to die cannot be made by the patient himself, and so a trusted person, like a family member, makes this decision. Finally, involuntary euthanasia occurs when the patient's death is brought about against his or her wishes. It goes without saying that this form of euthanasia will never be legal and should not be legal, as it's basically murder. Another differentiation that should be made is the difference between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. With euthanasia, the doctor is the one who delivers the lethal medicine to the patient, as an injection or an IV. With physician-assisted suicide, however, the doctor simply provides the means for the patient. The actual administering of the medication is to be done by the patient, by him or herself. At present, many people have different opinions on euthanasia. Only 5 states in the US have legalized physician-assisted suicide, though all have many different conditions that have to be met. For example, Oregon was the first state to legalize physician-assisted suicide under the Death with Dignity Act in October of 1997. This act requires that first, the person's over 18 years old, they're a resident of Oregon, they're capable to make this decision, they undergo psychological exams to ensure that they're in full mental health and are advised on what this decision means, and they have to be diagnosed with a terminal illness that will lead to death in 6 months or less. Along with the 5 states in the United States, Belgium, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Switzerland all allowed physician-assisted suicide. There are many reasons that people feel euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide should be legalized. I and many others believe it's a fundamental human right to decide when and how we die, and for the experience to be as quick and painless as possible. Here, I will point to the case of 29-year-old Brittany Maynard. You might have heard of her. Brittany made national headlines a few years ago after she was diagnosed with an aggressive terminal brain tumor. During her treatment, she decided to move her family to Oregon, where eventually she was legally able to end her life by assisted suicide. In an interview with People magazine, she explains that my glioblastoma, which is the type of cancer she had, is going to kill me, and that's out of my control. I've discussed with many experts how I would die from it, and it's a terrible, terrible way to die. Being able to choose to die with dignity is less terrifying. Death with dignity, as Brittany mentions, is another reason that I believe euthanasia practices should be legal. We grant animals quick, painless deaths by euthanizing them and by, quote, putting them out of their misery. My question is, why don't we extend this same courtesy to humans? At the end of his life, my grandfather had lost bowel control and was incontinent. He required 24-hour supervision and required his aides to bathe him, change him. It was horrible to watch and, embarrassing. If he was in his right state of mind, I can't imagine how embarrassed he'd be. At the end, he became violent and started lashing out at family members, his aides, and even my grandfather. Sometimes he had to be restrained because he was so confused. He did not die with dignity. We knew he was going to die this way, and what's more, he knew he was going to die this way. If physician-assisted suicide was legal in New Hampshire, where he was when the disease started, or Florida, where he moved to after his disease progressed, I believe he would have chosen to end his life peacefully rather than suffer through this disease and have our family suffer along with him. I believe that for euthanasia to become universally legal, attitudes need to change towards the subject. As individuals, we need to stop thinking that our beliefs and values are the best for everyone. If you could never imagine yourself one day wanting assistance in suicide because you are suffering from a terminal and debilitating disease, 1, you really don't know and can't make that decision until you're in the situation. And 2, just because you would not do so, you shouldn't stop someone else from making their own decisions. While I believe euthanasia should be legal, I definitely feel that there needs to be some regulations. I believe that the person needs to have a terminal disease that will take their life within the next years. The person should also be of sound mind and understand the procedure that will happen to them. I do not believe that the person should be over 18 to choose to die, but I could understand why many states have this policy in place. I believe it is a human right to choose to die. I believe that euthanasia will eventually become legal, but there is still a lot of work to do to get there. Thank you all for listening to my speech. I hope I have informed you about euthanasia and cleared up any misconceptions regarding the topic. I have also attached a link to the documentary The Suicide Tourist to this post. I really hope you'll all watch it. It definitely sparked my interest in the topic, and I believe it provides some very persuasive arguments for the legality of euthanasia. Thank you.